garbage collector was paralyzed on January 22, 2023, after sifting through a trash container near Columbia Park to find what was at the bottom of it. A blue suitcase was inside, sealed with black tape, and surrounded by several garbage bags. The suitcase contained a woman's body, which was easily identified because her head was visible from the suitcase. The worker was frightened upon finding something, so he drove several blocks and reported it to the police. The Capitol Police promptly dispatched a team of officers to investigate. Can you provide some examples? The police officers who arrived were met with a horrifying scene. The corpse was cradled in the suitcase and taken away. Valentina Tres Palacios was identified as the victim a few hours later. At the outset, the body was found to be free from any indications of violence, firearms, or knives, and it was not dismembered. Can you provide some examples? After opening the suitcase, detectives discovered that the woman was wearing pajamas with a belt, suggesting that she had been attacked while sleeping by the person who killed her. A black cardboard box on the side of the suitcase contained items that helped identify the body. Police found a student ID, a password used by the victim when applying for a certificate, as well as some documents and personal belongings among them. The investigating team found it peculiar, as the presence of documents in such cases was not typical. Can you provide some examples? The police contacted the woman's family after finding the suitcase with her body, and they confirmed that she was with friends on Saturday, January 21st. The woman was found to have been struck multiple times in the head during the forensic examination. Her body was found with multiple injuries, including bleeding from the right part of her tongue and 5 cuts around her neck that indicated strangulation. Valentina Tres Palacios was born on December 16, 2001, in Bogota, Colombia. She was enrolled in the Faculty of Commerce and International Business. The girl was a music enthusiast from an early age. After completing her professional DJ diploma, she was granted access to work as a DJ in Colombia due to her exceptional talent and musical sense. She had a career that began 3 years ago and resulted in many foreign friends. Valentina traveled to other countries where she typically gained knowledge or exhibited her accomplishments. She had the chance to perform alongside some of the most renowned musicians during this period. She toured over 20 cities in the country and was present at significant international events of this kind. Her past activities involved performing at festivals and touring throughout Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Brazil, and Peru. People in her vicinity claimed that she had a bright future ahead. She was sought after and traveled throughout the nation. She dominated the best nightclubs and pursued her passion. Valentina was a very happy, smiling young girl who enjoyed the party. She maintained social media accounts where she shared her stage performances and always kept her followers informed about her daily routine. Can you provide some examples? In the electronic music industry of Colombia, she was recently recognized as the best amateur DJ. The girl shared about 2 things on her social media: her rising popularity in the electronic music industry at nightclubs, and her relationship with an American named John Poulos, whom she met online by the end of 2021. John and Valentina's communication skills improved as time passed. Valentina's initial desire for stability and commitment was not strong, but her relationship with him transformed into a romantic partnership that the young people eventually shared. John Poulos was a resident of America. Valentina was so invested in her life that he sent her money to attend the cosmetic course that involved injecting her lips with hyaluronic acid. The procedure was repeated to improve her cheekbones, and John also suggested surgery and silicone breast implants for his partner, modifying her appearance within a few months and becoming the talk of the town. He started sending money to the girl on a regular basis and eventually came up with the idea of marrying her. Originally, Poulos had plans to move to Colombia and live with Valentina, but she was skeptical because this person was so envious that he hired a private detective to track all her contacts and activities. Valentina's family was highly suspicious as she expressed her concern about this situation. John Poulos was prepared to spend the rest of his life with his partner by January 2023. He was committed to marrying Valentina and initiated the process of organizing the necessary paperwork. He rented an apartment in the northern area of Bogota, where he planned to spend the weekends with the girl until they found a permanent place to live. On Thursday, January 19th, Poulos arrived in Bogota. Around 8:53 p.m., he was caught on surveillance footage entering the building's apartment. Along with him, there was a blue suitcase that bore resemblance to the one used to find Valentina's corpse. John Poulos was the first person to be noticed after the disturbing discovery, as he was also the last one to have seen Valentina alive. The detectives' attempt to reach him resulted in the call being diverted to voicemail. Valentina's family members found Poulos to be a kind and collected individual. His demeanor was undeniable, and his plans to marry the young woman were evident. They were unable to fathom his involvement in this terrible crime, but these doubts were eliminated when investigators arrived at the apartment rental building, where it was discovered that the man had already left and was not found. On Monday, January 23rd, John Poulos took down his social media profiles in the early morning following Valentina's death. He was the sole suspect at that point. The revelation was made evident when investigators analyzed the surveillance camera footage in the building. From Friday evening to early Sunday morning, the Colombian police and prosecutor's office examined hours of video footage from cameras in the areas where the young woman and her boyfriend were. The trash container was where the body was disposed of at this point. The footage and numerous WhatsApp conversations were instrumental in uncovering the girl's final hours. On January 20th, Valentina and Poulos made a deal to meet. Can you provide some examples? The man arrived on the 19th, the day before, and took up residence in the apartment where the couple had planned to live. After he texted Valentina, they started arguing on the same night because she was at a party with her friend and didn't anticipate him coming over. He inquired about the presence of significant individuals at the gathering and whether she was with any male. She wryly replied with a no, stating that it was his suspicions, and they had agreed to meet on the 20th. Prior to meeting John, Valentina had planned to visit various locations to care for herself, apply her lash extensions, and attend hair salons. On January 20th, the couple were unable to see each other due to their disagreement, and only in the evening, when Valentina's apartment was being monitored by surveillance cameras, did they know exactly when they were in that parking lot. The girls' possessions were being packed by John at 6 p.m. as the two of them moved to another apartment and began a new life. Valentina's journey across the country was marked by a series of emotional goodbyes, one of which was with her family and friends. She made a video call to her mother saying that she was going home. The video depicts the girl accompanied by Poulos, who hired a vehicle to transport Valentina's possessions. They were caught on surveillance footage entering the apartment with their possessions at 7 p.m. Valentina sent her mother a series of videos showing the apartment in their frequent exchanges to get things. The cameras captured them completing the move and engaging in other activities before heading back to their new home. It was Saturday, January 21st at 1 a.m. Around 3 a.m., the couple arranged a taxi to go to southeastern New York's nightclub, where Valentina was set to perform 2 hours later. Can you provide some examples? The club was reached by them at approximately 4 a.m. Valentina commenced work almost immediately. While she was busy, John Poulos remained with her. Can you provide some examples? At approximately 5 a.m., her performance concluded. Valentina and John, holding hands, headed to the nightclub's office. They encountered the proprietor of the establishment, his spouse, and her companion. Valentina's friends had not seen her since they left the venue at 6 a.m. Her smile was back on her face, shining brightly, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. Valentina contacted her friend on the phone and stated that she had no intention of going anywhere on Saturday. She stated that she would probably stay in the apartment with her partner. Later on, they might go out to eat or cook together at their house. The last time Valentina spoke to her friend was at 9 p.m., and it was through video. Valentina's mother, Laura Hidalgo, revealed that her 13-year-old son was the final individual to converse with her on video. The girl was in bed with John. They both appeared to be in a state of happiness. The family had no further information about them. On January 21st, at 10:43 p.m., surveillance cameras in the building captured the young woman and her boyfriend. In the video, Valentina can be seen peering out of the apartment door while John stands in front of it. He seems contemplative and a little menacing, pacing back and forth, occasionally grimacing his face. He orders the elevator to go down and retrieve a delivery. Poulos was captured by the cameras again on Sunday, January 22nd at 9 a.m. He exits the room with 2 bags of garbage. Valentina was nowhere to be found on this occasion. The man drives to the parking area, takes a silver car, and places the bags in the back seat. Following that, he goes back to the apartment and retrieves 2 suitcases from the trunk. Subsequently, he heads back to the apartment. A gray blanket covers the suitcase that Poulos removed from the apartment where the clerk reads 10 a.m. He put it into a cart for shipping. A second bag was situated beside it. Valentina's head was wrapped in the blanket. The man surveys the parking area after parking. He perceives that nobody is in the vicinity. Moving ahead, he looks over to make sure nobody is going down in the elevator. Subsequently, he rapidly makes his way back to the vehicle. He glances at the mirror one last time and takes a sip of water before struggling to lift the heavy suitcase, which he puts in the trunk. The bag is the next item on the list. Subsequently, he takes control of the vehicle and departs. Surveillance cameras caught the car at different locations throughout the city around noon. It was evident that the subject was in search of a suitable spot to leave the suitcase. The car entered one of the parks and parked near the garbage containers at approximately 3 p.m. The driver exited and headed towards the container at that juncture. He surveyed the area, verified that no one was watching, and then removed the suitcase, which seemed excessive, before tossing it into the container. He went back to the car and removed the bag, which he'd then placed in the trash bin, closed the lid, and exited. The vehicle was traveling westward until it reached El Dorado International Airport. John's last known whereabouts were at the airport at 4:30 p.m. A $1 million reward was announced by the Ministry of Security on Monday, January 23rd for any information that could lead to the arrest of the person or persons responsible for the murder of Valentina Tres Palacios. The Colombian authorities enlisted the help of Interpol to issue an arrest warrant as Poulos fled the country's border without indicating why. Additionally, he was the final person to witness the girl's existence. Can you provide some examples? On January 24th, the National Police of Panama stated that they had apprehended Poulos at El Dorado International Airport while he was traveling to Turkey. In an effort to obtain answers about Valentina's death, Colombian authorities quickly began the process of deporting him to the country. Over 14 criminal investigation specialists contributed to the investigation, collecting evidence to establish the facts. The analysis of over 300 hours of video footage from cameras was the outcome of methodological work carried out in partnership with the country's prosecutor office. The case yielded another crucial finding after the arrest of this individual. Valentina's mobile phone was discovered near the El Dorado International Airport by a security staff member. He stumbled upon a mobile phone on the grass while walking near a tenth of a minute gas station and picked it up. The man brought the discovered gadget home after he realized that it did not have a SIM card. He took the phone to sell it, unaware that it belonged to Valentina. The security guard's wife called him hours later in despair when she realized that the photo of the girl in the wallpaper on the mobile phone was identical to those seen on social media and also for the young woman found dead in the trash container. Unfortunately, the phone had already been marked for sale and repackaged because someone was willing to buy it. Therefore, information that could have been advantageous in this situation went unguarded. Can you provide some examples? Following that, the driver of the car that the couple had driven to the nightclub gave his testimony, which was followed by a big question. The driver was tasked with transporting the couple to a nightclub located in the southern part of the city. Before getting into the car, Poulos paused for a moment before Valentina exited. She got into the car and screamed that she had written something untoward. The driver looked at her in disbelief before checking his phone and finding out that Tres Palacios had sent him a message to customer care, warning him in Spanish that he was in danger. The driver looked at the girl and inquired if she was all right, but her response was uncertain as Poulos entered the car and asked. She said, "Are you okay?" John and Valentina conversed in English as the car was being driven, and the man asked if they were bilingual, to which he replied with a positive answer. Poulos remained silent and instead corresponded with Valentina on WhatsApp. Upon leaving about 4 a.m., the driver went to the nightclub with the couple and then forgot about the incident until he was informed of the young woman's death several days later. Due to Valentina's open WhatsApp session, her friend who lived in Cartagena came to the prosecutor office in Bogota and surrendered their computer with the chats providing clues about what had occurred. One of the pieces of evidence found in Valentina's chat was that her friend had spotted a suitcase with her body, which was said to have been there. The friend said that on the same day Valentina was in Bogota, she got a text from Pulas and received several selfies with his luggage. The suitcase that John brought with him was akin to the one found by authorities in the container. The color was indistinguishable. There's no clear answer as to why the young girl left her WhatsApp session open on her friend's computer, but all of these texts helped authorities get what happened that night when Valentina was killed. It was determined by forensic investigators that she died from asphyxiation caused by being tightly strangled with a rope. Prior to her passing, there were indications on her body that she had been a victim of violence. All indications from the forensic examination indicate that Valentina Tres Palacios passed away while sleeping. This conclusion was drawn up by criminalists because she was wearing pajamas. There was no doubt in the evidence above that John Pulos was present. The indictment stated that the suspect did not acknowledge responsibility for the girl's death, citing the current situation and the concealment of evidence. Rather, he said, "There were violations when I was arrested in Panama because we did not have a lawyer to talk to." Pulos' Spanish language skills were not strong enough to warrant a translator, and the hearing lasted for more than 5 hours. The crime committed by Pulos is attributed to his involvement with Valentina, and he attempted to disappear without a trace, erasing his social media accounts after the incident. On May 19, 1987, John Pulos was born in Wisconsin, United States. He had 3 children and was previously wedded in his native land. His criminal record included charges of violence against women, including obtaining a restraining order against his ex-wife. The use of pornographic websites was reported by a woman to whom John Pulos had sent money who claimed that this person was actively browsing. According to her, he spent approximately 5-6 hours daily on the site, and she mentioned that despite being a man, his behavior was often bizarre in nature, such as fantasizing and recounting ghost stories. Another model who testified on a modeling page said she knew the American from Texas, America. She ceased writing to him after a peculiar comment he made, which included the words jealousy and death. John's question was, "If I were at a bar, would you be willing to talk to me?" The girl refused in response. "It's likely that one of us will die due to jealousy," replied Pulos. The witness stated that despite the subject having sent money to the magical lord, she never conversed with him on video because his communication was often unusual. It is important to acknowledge that John had certain conduct towards his victims. He contacted Valentina on social media and started sending her money with persistence and consistency in the case. This approach to women's treatment as property was a warning sign that the trusting women initially neglected, and Pulos believed he could purchase them with money from the outset. The factors were disregarded, leading to the possibility that the victim unintentionally stumbled into her abuser's trap and was eventually recognized due to his own mistake. The authorities involved in this case are assuming that John thought the waste disposal system in Colombia was equivalent to that in the United States, where he resided. According to him, the waste material had settled in the container and would eventually be disposed of. Pulos did not assume that recycling workers and street dwellers frequently sift through garbage to discover items that can be sold or employed as something. John Pulos is being held in a private cell in Bogota today. Now all that remains is to demonstrate that all these pieces of evidence connect the individual to the crime and to discover the motive behind this dreadful murder. In Colombia, the criminal code provides for a prison sentence of up to 50 years for a crime in which an American is accused. With the assistance of a special group formed by the Capitol Police in coordination with the country's Attorney General's office, criminal investigators will be engaged in the search for material evidence to clarify this fact. Such cases once again demonstrate to us how dangerous social networks can be when getting to know someone. Valentina thought she had found love and someone with whom she would spend the rest of her days. However, this did not happen, and like many people in the world, she too thought that nothing like this would happen to her. Stacy Pinnell was born on September 5, 1967, in the small American town of Ripley, Mississippi. She had a younger brother and sister with whom she spent a lot of time and got along well with. Stacy was an energetic person with many friends. In school, she enjoyed participating in extracurricular activities. She joined the marching band, where she played a decorative wooden rifle. After graduating from high school in 1985, she attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Although it was about a 30-minute drive from her home, she decided to live in the dormitory. From the first days of college, Stacy was thrilled, made many friends, and joined the local marching band. On October 7, 1985, Stacy attended a training session after school, met up with her boyfriend, and went to a party on campus. At 12:30 a.m., she returned to the dormitory with her friends. They chatted for a bit, and then she went to sleep. At around 2:30 a.m., her roommate, Amy Wheeler, returned to the dormitory after the party but had lost her keys and had to knock on the door. The room was designed for 2 people, so only Stacy could open the door. However, there was no response to the knocking. Amy waited there for a few minutes before deciding to knock on the adjacent room's door. The dormitory was designed such that there was a common bathroom between the 2 rooms, so Amy could go through the bathroom of the adjacent room. A student named Stephanie Alexander lived in that room, who woke up to the knocking and opened the door. Both girls were surprised that Stacy did not respond to the knocking, so they entered her room together. The room was completely dark, and the only light came from a very dim lamp. Amy entered the room and saw Stacy lying on her bed, but one of her legs was hanging down, and she felt that something was not right with her friend. Getting closer, she was horrified to see blood on the bed. After recovering from the shock, she ran out of the room to get help. Other students responded to her screams, and the dormitory guard called 911. The police arrived and found an alarming scene. Stacy was dead, and there were traces of blood all over the room. There was a pillow over her face, and her underwear was pulled down. The investigators also noticed that someone had cut the mosquito netting of the window. Next to the bed, they found a wooden rifle that Stacy had used in parades with the marching band. It was covered in blood and wrapped in a towel. The police assumed the rifle had been used in the murder. Upon examining the crime scene more closely, forensic experts found a short hair on the victim's bed. All this was enough to form a preliminary picture of what had happened. Someone had made a hole in the window of Stacy's room, climbed in, raped, and murdered her. However, this version of events quickly revealed some inconsistencies. The size of the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for an adult to pass through. The window in question was situated at a certain height from the ground, which would have made the perpetrator's task more difficult. The police did not find the cut piece of the mosquito netting either. Furthermore, forensic experts examined the victim's body and found no traces of male biological material, casting doubt on the theory that the victim had been raped. At the same time, the pathologist confirmed that the wooden rifle, with a high degree of probability, was the murder weapon, as the injury characteristics indicated that the victim had been struck multiple times with it. Experts also did not find any defensive wounds on her body, suggesting that the victim did not resist the attacker. All possible evidence from Stacy's room was collected by crime scene investigators, but none of it furthered the investigation. At the time, DNA analysis was not commonly used, so the investigators could not examine the blood samples or other potential biological traces. Additionally, no fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, as the perpetrator had apparently wiped it clean with the towel. Despite the lack of leads, detectives still hoped that experts might find something in the room, so they decided to take fingerprints from all individuals who theoretically could have entered the women's dormitory. This task proved to be very difficult as the police had to speak with hundreds of male university students and ask them to volunteer their fingerprints. They also took prints from all male staff members. The problem was that only girls lived in this residence, and a special key was needed to enter the building. Men could only enter in a few instances, such as being let in by residents or being college employees with a key. Nevertheless, the female residents frequently invited their boyfriends and male friends, which meant that the officers had to spend a lot of time collecting their fingerprints. However, in the end, this led to no results, since no matching prints were found at the crime scene. With no leads, the investigators turned to a psychologist and asked for a psychological profile of the killer. After reviewing all the available information, the specialist posited that the attacker was likely a man between 20 and 24 years old with a strong physical build and no criminal record. The psychologist believed that the crime was not premeditated. The killer saw an opportunity and decided to attack the victim. This description made the officers further doubt that the criminal had entered the room through the window, as the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for a large, adult man to pass through. Meanwhile, panic spread among the college students. The female students were afraid to be in their residences, fearing they could become the next victim of the unknown assailant. The fact that the police could not find any clues only heightened the overall anxiety. The officers continued to search for possible suspects and decided to investigate Stacy's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne. They searched his room in the residence and found nothing to suggest his involvement. Investigators found it impossible to establish whether Stacy Pinnell's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne, had any motive for her murder. According to Stacy's friends, the couple rarely argued and had no significant issues. However, the investigators learned from Stacy's parents that before starting college, she had another boyfriend named Ben with whom she had broken up just a few months earlier. Ben and Stacy had been in a long-term relationship during school, and he had even given her a ring, hoping to marry her in the future. But Stacy ended the relationship. Despite Ben's reluctance to accept the breakup and his refusal to take the ring back, Stacy did not change her decision. Up until Stacy left for college, Ben repeatedly tried to meet with her, but she remained firm in her decision. The detective spoke with Ben, who claimed that on the night of the murder, he was asleep at home. His mother corroborated his alibi, stating that he went to bed around 11 p.m. and was home the next morning. However, the investigators considered the possibility that Ben could have left the house undetected, gone to Stacy's college, committed the murder, and then returned home. Ben agreed to undergo a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. The operator could not determine if he was telling the truth. A second interrogation yielded the same results. This made the detective suspicious, but without concrete evidence, they could not link him to the crime. Experts attempted to determine if the hair found on Stacy's bed belonged to Ben, but they were unable to reach a definitive conclusion. Since DNA analysis was not commonly used at that time to confirm or refute such evidence, it was not possible to do so. Due to the uncertain polygraph results, Ben became the prime suspect in the case, but Stacy's relatives did not believe he was capable of harming her. They described him as kind and well-mannered, always taking care of her. However, without evidence, the police could not charge him, and the search for clues continued. Later on, the investigators re-examined the case materials and noticed something peculiar. When examining the cut in the mosquito netting, they observed that the fibers were directed towards the outside rather than inside, indicating that the piece had been cut from within Stacy's room, not from outside. This discovery further puzzled the detectives. If the killer did not enter through the window, he must have had a key or entered with one of the residents. However, the police doubted this was possible since there was a guard in the dormitory who sat near the entrance and watched everyone who came in and out. For several months, there were no significant developments in the case. Then, the lead detective decided to seek assistance from Steve Rhodes, the sheriff of Illinois, who was well known in law enforcement circles for his unique approach to interrogations based on neuro-linguistic programming. He frequently spoke at police seminars and had a reputation for being able to extract information from almost any suspect and detect lies. Steve agreed to interrogate 4 people involved in the case: Stacy's neighbors, Amy and Stephanie, as well as Ben and Tommy. In September 1986, he began his work, starting with Amy. She recounted everything she knew, and the officer found no reason to doubt her words. He then spoke with Stephanie, who said that on the night in question, she took an anti-inflammatory medication prescribed by a doctor and went to sleep. At around 12:30 a.m., Stephanie heard Stacy and her friends returning to the dormitory and talking loudly in Stacy's room. Stephanie went to ask them to speak more quietly. After her request, Stacy's friends left for their rooms and Stephanie went to bed. However, Steve Rhodes, an experienced investigator, sensed that Stephanie was withholding important details. He accused her of lying and urged her to tell the truth. Despite Stephanie's insistence that she was not deceiving him, Rhodes continued to press her with questions until she finally revealed that she had returned to Stacy's room after the friends had left. This was a shocking development for the detectives nearly a year after the murder. After a long pause during the questioning, Stephanie, to everyone's surprise, confessed that she had killed Stacy. According to Stephanie, she had entered Stacy's room for a chat. At some point, the conversation turned to Tommy Osborne, Stacy's boyfriend. Stephanie complimented Tommy, which upset Stacy. When Stacy demanded that Stephanie stay away from Tommy, the conversation escalated. After an exchange of words, Stacy slapped Stephanie, who retaliated in kind. The altercation became physical, and at some point, Stephanie grabbed a wooden rifle next to the bed and struck Stacy, causing her to fall onto the bed. Stephanie then hit Stacy several times more until she stopped moving. Realizing what she had done after seeing the blood, Stephanie panicked and decided to dispose of the evidence. She locked the bedroom door, washed the blood off her hands, and then staged the scene to make it look as if someone had broken into the room, raped, and killed Stacy. She placed a pillow over Stacy's head, pulled down her underwear, and then cut a hole in the mosquito netting, hiding the cut piece in Stacy's closet under a pile of clothes. She cleaned the wooden rifle with a towel and took a shower to remove any traces of blood. Stephanie then decided to get rid of her t-shirt and the piece of mosquito netting she had cut. She locked herself in the bathroom and burned them, then masked the smell of smoke by spraying a large amount of perfume. After covering her tracks, Stephanie went to bed and was only awakened when Amy knocked on her door. The detectives were astonished by this confession. For a whole year, it had never occurred to them that the killer could be a woman, let alone Stacy's dormitory neighbor. Stephanie was arrested and charged with Stacy's murder. 3 days later, she wrote a letter to her boyfriend, whom she had been dating for a week at the university, detailing the events and claiming it was an accident. She wrote that on the day of the murder, she had taken some energy pills and was not thinking clearly. She didn't even remember the moment of the murder, but had seen it in nightmares throughout the year. Days after sending the letter, the case took another unexpected turn. Stephanie claimed that Steve Rhodes had put her in some sort of trance using his techniques and had implanted the confession in her mind. She insisted she couldn't have killed Stacy and accused the police of taking advantage of her vulnerable state to close the case. According to her, the energy pills clouded her mind, allowing Steve Rhodes to convince her over time that she had indeed killed her neighbor. In 1987, a judge held 3-day hearings to determine the truth of her statements. The detectives asserted that Stephanie had not been subjected to any undue pressure and that no one had hypnotized her. They argued that in her confession, she mentioned details only the murderer could know, such as where she hid the knife used to cut the mosquito netting. The detectives hadn't found it during their initial investigation, but after Stephanie's confession, they found the knife in the closet under a pile of clothes. However, there were nuances. Firstly, the girls were neighbors and often entered each other's rooms, so Stephanie might have known about the knife's location under different circumstances. Secondly, no evidence could confirm or refute that the net had been cut with that specific knife. Nonetheless, the judge concluded that Stephanie's initial testimony was not obtained through hypnosis or any other form of manipulation. The trial began in 1988. Stephanie's lawyers continued to argue that her confession was coerced and highlighted the lack of evidence against their client. They emphasized that the lie detection tactics used by Steve Rhodes were not scientifically founded and could not be used in court according to the law. Rhodes claimed that one could tell if someone was lying by observing their eye movements. Furthermore, Stephanie's lawyers presented medical examination results indicating that her cognitive abilities could have been impaired due to the energy pills, making her more susceptible to manipulation like hypnosis. The prosecution argued that Stephanie knew details unknown to investigators at the time of the interrogation, making her testimony credible. They also conducted a court experiment with a psychological sciences doctor attempting to hypnotize her, concluding that it was not possible to induce such a state in her. The victim's relatives also shared interesting information, stating that Steve Rhodes had mentioned Stephanie several times, considering her a problematic person and, to some extent, fearing her. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury eventually found Stephanie guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentencing her to 20 years in prison, of which she served 9 before being released on parole. Once freed, Stephanie continued to maintain her innocence and hired lawyers to revisit the case. During their review, the lawyers noticed similarities with another murder committed in 1993. At that time, a man named Charles Crawford attacked a girl who lived 40 minutes away by car from the college Stacy Pinnell attended. There were some notable similarities between these two cases. Firstly, the other victim also attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Secondly, the perpetrator entered her home by cutting a hole in the mosquito netting. Stephanie and her lawyers believe that Charles Crawford could be behind Stacy's murder. Crawford was arrested in 1993 and subsequently sentenced to death. The challenge lies in the lack of evidence to prove his guilt in Stacy's case. However, there were significant developments. Stephanie's lawyers discovered that on the wooden rifle found at the crime scene, there was a drop of blood that did not belong to Stacy. DNA analysis of this evidence had not been carried out at the time, as a case review was necessary to proceed with it. Additionally, the victim's underwear was sent to an independent expert, and they were able to extract a DNA sample from an unknown male. This sample has not been added to the FBI's database for comparison with Crawford's DNA, because a case review is required for that as well. Moreover, there is no guarantee that the sample found is related to the murder. Supporting the possibility of Crawford's involvement, the lawyers pointed out other facts. Crawford lived near the college at that time, and allegedly 2 witnesses saw him near the campus a few days before the murder. However, there is no reliable confirmation of this sighting. Despite similarities between the 2 crimes, there are discrepancies. The cut in the mosquito netting was made from inside the room to the outside, which discounts the possibility of an intruder entering from the street. Additionally, Crawford's height was 6 feet and 1 inch, making it unlikely that he could fit through such a small opening. Another contentious point is that the murderer used Stacy's wooden rifle as a weapon. If Crawford had really decided to enter the victim's room and kill her, it is hard to imagine that he would not have brought a weapon with him. Currently, Stephanie and her lawyers are still trying to obtain a case review that would allow comparison of the evidence with Crawford's DNA. Crawford remains on death row, having even spoken with detectives about Stacy's case. But the police could not determine if he was near the college on the night of the murder. Paradise Beach turned into a death track for lovers. It is believed that an investigation on the heels of a crime is the most effective and often leads to success. The methodology itself implies immediate response, operational collection of evidence, and questioning of witnesses, which significantly increases the chances of quickly solving the case and holding the guilty accountable. However, if it is not possible to identify the perpetrator, the investigation can drag on for years and even decades until the criminal case is frozen and transferred to the archive after the statute of limitations expires. However, sometimes unsolved and seemingly hopeless investigations receive unexpected developments many years later, which helps to find the right lead and achieve results when no one believed it anymore. The case of Lindsay Cutshall and Jason Allen, which had been gathering dust on the shelves for almost 15 years, is a prime example of this. At the time, it was not possible to solve it despite the operational actions of the investigative team and the high reward offered for any information. The main problem was the lack of motive for such a brutal act against the loving couple. In addition to this, it was not possible to find any witnesses, murder weapons, or any significant clues. It was a typical dead end, and no one hoped that the truth would ever be discovered. However, a decade and a half later, solving this case was helped by another brutal crime. It also turned out that at least 4 people knew what had happened, but all these years they remained silent. Who were Lindsay Cutshall and Jason Allen? Lindsay Cutshall was born in the small town of White Eyes in Coshocton County, Ohio in 1982. She grew up in a very religious family, and her father was a pastor of a Christian community. Despite a strict upbringing from childhood, she was very active, engaged in sports, and later became interested in hiking and extreme tourism. After finishing school, Lindsay became a student at Appalachian Bible College in West Virginia. During those years, she regularly climbed mountains of various difficulty levels, rafted down turbulent mountain rivers, and even organized hikes herself. The young woman dreamed of founding her own summer camp for children and teenagers, where she could teach them the basics of survival in the wild, rafting, tourism, and so on. Jason Allen was born in the city of Zeeland in the American state of Michigan in 1978. He also grew up in a deeply religious family and from a teenage age was seriously interested in hiking tours, mastering survival in the wild. The young man was tall, athletic, toned, possessed leadership qualities, and was able to find like-minded people to conquer new heights. Couple met in 2002 during a hiking trip in the Appalachians. At that time, Lindsay was still a student, while Jason worked as a mountain guide and climbing instructor. The young people immediately felt mutual sympathy, and just 6 months after their first meeting, the young man came to the girl's parents and asked for their daughter's hand in marriage. Her parents were not opposed and gave their blessing to the lovers. The young man's parents also approved of his choice, after which the couple was officially engaged. Allen presented the young woman with a beautiful diamond ring for this occasion, which was soon to be complemented by another, an engagement ring. The young couple planned to get married in September 2004, had big plans for their future together, and wanted to buy their own large house where they could live comfortably and raise their children. Unfortunately, these plans were not meant to come true. The final trip. In the summer of 2004, Lindsay and Jason worked as senior counselors at a Christian summer camp called Rock and Water, located in El Dorado County, California. After their wedding, they planned to open their own similar camp. So they were gaining experience and learning the nuances of working with the younger generation. On the evening of Friday, August 14th of that year, the couple decided to take a weekend trip to the San Francisco area. They informed their colleagues of their plans in advance, leaving 2 of the most experienced counselors in charge of the camp. Lindsay and Jason promised to return by Monday, so their short journey was expected to cause no complications, either for the couple or for their temporary replacements. They set off in a 1992 Redford Tempo, owned by Lindsay, and that was the last time anyone saw them alive. By Sunday evening, the counselors had not returned to the camp, but no alarm was raised then, as everyone was confident that the couple would arrive either late at night or early Monday morning. However, when it was discovered after the morning roll call at 8 a.m. that Jason and Lindsay were still missing and their phones were unreachable, their colleagues decided to contact the police and also informed the missing couple's families about the situation. The parents, horrified upon hearing the news, rushed to the camp to learn more about the incident. Everyone knew that the couple was very responsible in their duties. They were never late, and if any unforeseen circumstances had occurred, they would have found a way to communicate that. The challenging search. Upon arrival at the camp, law enforcement officials interviewed the couple's colleagues, and the investigation immediately encountered a serious problem. No one could precisely say where the young couple had gone. It was only known that they planned to explore around San Francisco, and given their great love for adventure and extreme leisure, they could be in the most remote corners where there was neither communication nor civilization. While the police waited the legally mandated 2 days during which the missing were expected to report themselves, relatives and friends decided not to just sit back, but to organize a search themselves. They called everyone they knew, trying to find out when the couple last made contact with anyone, distributed flyers with photos of the bride and groom, and requested anyone who might have seen them to respond immediately. By Tuesday, law enforcement had joined the search operation. The main search unfolded around San Francisco, its suburbs and surroundings. However, the area was vast and it was simply not possible to thoroughly comb through it. Then, one of the friends noted that the couple loved the wild, rocky beaches that were always beautiful and secluded, prompting the police to focus on these areas. Bodies in sleeping bags. For several days, the search yielded no results, and the hope of finding the couple alive was diminishing rapidly. Then, on Wednesday, August 19th, a patrol helicopter flying over one of the rocky wild beaches reported that 2 bodies were found in sleeping bags on the desolate coast, and it seemed unlikely they were just resting there. The first thing police encountered upon arriving at the scene was a red Ford Tempo parked on a cliff near a lookout point in a small shelter for tourists, from which a steep trail led directly to the scenic wild beach. The car was immediately checked in the database and found to belong to the missing student, Lindsay Cutshall. Descending the trail to the beach, law enforcement found 2 bright sleeping bags containing individuals. At first, it might have seemed they were merely sleeping, but no response came to calls or noise. Approaching closer, the officers saw that the sleeping bags contained a young man and woman, both showing no signs of life. A brief initial examination suggested that their lives had been taken by gunshot wounds to the head, and given the distinctive smell of decomposition, they had been there for more than a day. All the belongings of the deceased, including mobile phones and wallets containing bank cards and cash, were found beside them. Therefore, a robbery as the main motive was almost immediately ruled out. The keys to the parked car above were also visibly placed, ruling out car theft as a motive. Investigators immediately suspected that the deceased were the same young people who had gone missing last week near San Francisco. Their suspicion was confirmed by documents found nearby under the names Lindsay Cutshall and Jason Allen, but the bodies still needed to be identified by relatives. The arriving parents of the couple, who had hoped until the last that the remains belonged to someone else, were devastated by grief upon recognizing their children. Investigation and initial theories. Thus, theories involving robbery or an attempted carjacking were dismissed since all valuables, money and keys were left untouched in plain sight. Moreover, forensic analysis revealed no signs of physical assault or intimate assault on the bodies, except for the gunshot wounds to the head. It appeared that Lindsay and Jason were simply sleeping peacefully at the time of the incident, and did not have a chance to react. They made no attempt to defend themselves, flee, or even get out of their sleeping bags. Everything pointed to a swift act that resembled an execution or vendetta. But who could have taken the lives of 2 individuals in such a brutal manner and why? The questions multiplied, but no answers were forthcoming. There were no signs that anyone else had stayed in the area. The beach was quite secluded, and accessing it via the steep trail was challenging. Despite efforts, no shell casings were found nearby, leading investigators to theorize that the shooter either took them or threw them into the ocean. The shots had been fired at close range into the heads of the sleeping tourists, indicated by specific traces, so the casings, if not deliberately moved, would have been nearby. Interestingly, the beach appeared quite clean. Yet a few meters from where the sleeping bags with the bodies were found, an empty beer bottle lay. The deceased did not drink alcohol as they led a healthy lifestyle, suggesting the bottle might belong to the mysterious shooter. This particular brand of beer was rarely found in the area and likely came from a neighboring state. As no other clues were found, this bottle was considered a significant lead, although it was unclear whether it had any connection to the shooter or the crime. A theory was proposed that the deceased might have had a conflict with someone the day before the tragedy, and their opponent returned at night with a weapon to settle the score. Although Jason and Lindsay were very friendly with everyone, it was not excluded that they might have inadvertently displeased someone either in appearance or for some other reason. Additionally, the shooter could have been intoxicated or mentally unstable. From the bullets extracted from the victims' skulls, experts determined they were fired from a Marlin brand rifle, .45 caliber, model 1894, produced by Marlin Firearms Company. This was a rare weapon that might have been part of a collector's arsenal. Such models were typically used for hunting. This clue was significant for the ongoing investigation, but it remained the only one for the time being. Investigators speculated that the shooter was likely a male acting alone. He could have been a hunter, collector, or firearm enthusiast. The couple's route, search, and witness interviews. The investigation now aimed to establish the route the couple had taken, who they might have contacted, and when they were last seen alive. The first task presented few issues, as the couple had taken numerous photos and their camera remained untouched among their personal belongings. Additionally, in the tourist cabin near the lookout point where they parked their car, there was a guest book where visitors could leave notes. The engaged couple had written a couple of entries expressing that it was one of the best weekends of their lives, filled with love, happiness, and the discovery of perhaps the most beautiful beach they had ever seen. It was discovered that on Saturday, the couple had stopped at a fishing pier about 20 miles from where their lives were ultimately taken. This was evidenced by the photographs they had taken there, prompting law enforcement to visit the area and speak with locals in search of potential witnesses. Many remembered the young couple traveling in a red car. They were looking for a place to stay overnight, but found no vacancies in any of the 3 nearby hotels. This was because August is peak tourist season in the area, and most travelers booked their accommodations well in advance. The couple then dined at a local restaurant, walked around the area, took several photos, and set off again in the evening. According to everyone who saw and interacted with them, they were friendly, engaged in no conflicts, and appeared happy and carefree. None of the witnesses could recall anything suspicious or unusual. Notably, the beach where the bodies were found was located in a protected area where camping was prohibited. However, since the young people could not find a place to stay overnight, they decided to settle on the beach, but chose not to set up a tent, instead using their sleeping bags. They believed that on a warm August night on a secluded beach, they faced no threats and planned to head back at dawn to return to the rock and water camp on Sunday as promised. This information helped narrow down the time frame during which the couple was likely taken from life. They went to sleep but did not survive until morning, indicating they were likely taken from life between 11 o'clock Saturday night and dawn on Sunday. The first suspect. Although the investigation into the double taking of life was in full swing and news broadcasts urged anyone with any relevant information to contact the police, law enforcement withheld certain details. In particular, the results of the ballistics analysis were kept secret to avoid alerting the suspect and prompting them to hastily dispose of the weapon used in the crime. Initially, suspicion fell on a local drifter who periodically slept on that very beach and had been seen nearby on the evening before the crime. The homeless man, mentioned by some witnesses, was quickly located, brought to the station, and interrogated. The 57-year-old suspect had no alibi for the night of the crime. However, his involvement could not be confirmed. The main reasons were the absence of the weapon used in the crime and the fact that his DNA did not match that found on the beer bottle discovered on the beach. A new phase of the investigation in 2006. For nearly 2 years, the investigation had been at a standstill with no clear direction on how to proceed. Then, in the spring of 2006, law enforcement decided to publicize the data they had on the weapon used in the crime and to reach out again to potential witnesses by offering a $50,000 reward for any useful information that could lead to the perpetrator. Following this announcement, about 1,000 calls came in, but most did not aid the advancement of the investigation. However, law enforcement became interested in 26-year-old Sean Gowlin, pointed out by several locals. According to them, the young man collected firearms and bladed weapons, behaved aggressively, was frequently involved in conflicts, threatened acts of violence, and occasionally damaged other people's property. Sean was arrested and questioned. He had previously been on the police's radar for brawling, hooliganism, and driving under the influence of alcohol and drugs. He indeed had an impressive collection of weapons, but the specific rifle in question was not among them. Verifying his alibi from 2 years prior proved impossible, and his DNA did not match the sample found on the beer bottle at the crime scene, so Gowlin had to be released. A suspect from another country? Simultaneously, another suspicious and aggressive drifter came under scrutiny, often seen with a firearm, frightening the local residents. His name was Joseph Henry Burgess, and he was 61 years old at the time of the couple's demise. Burgess often ranted about receiving commands from God. It was discovered that in the late 1970s, Joseph lived in Canada, where he also wandered aimlessly. In 1978, he joined the Commune of the Children of God, positioning himself as a deeply religious person. And according to those around him, he was quite the fanatic. He soon had a conflict with 2 young people that escalated into outright enmity. And a few weeks later, these individuals were found lifeless, each with several close-range gunshot wounds to the head. Notably, their bodies were also discovered on a beach in sleeping bags, seemingly taken while they slept. By the time the police arrived, Burgess had vanished. His guilt was proven through numerous left-behind clues, but he could not be convicted as he had fled to the USA, crossing the border illegally. He managed to evade capture for nearly a quarter of a century until the police connected him with the double homicide on a beach in California. However, they were unable to interrogate him as a shootout occurred during his apprehension, resulting in the deaths of a police sergeant and Burgess himself, who opened fire, a fatal echo from the past. In the spring of 2017 in Forestville, California, a tragedy unfolded one night on March 14th. Gunshots rang out in the Gowlin family home, prompting alarmed neighbors to immediately call the police. The victim was 35-year-old Seamus Gowlin, and the perpetrator was his older brother, Sean. An argument had erupted between the siblings, during which Sean, under the influence of prohibited substances, grabbed a firearm and discharged 3 bullets into his younger brother. Police recognized the shooter's name, as Sean had previously been detained as a suspect in the double homicide on a beach, but was released due to a lack of evidence. Since then, he had been in police sites twice for property damage and making threats, but had only received fines. It was also discovered that the detainee was an avid hunter and had a hobby of crafting knives and other bladed weapons. Those around him described him as antisocial, aggressive, and unpredictable. After taking his brother's life, Sean attempted to flee but was almost immediately apprehended. Law enforcement then decided to thoroughly reinvestigate this man's potential involvement in a couple's perpetration from 13 years prior. His personal social media page revealed much, where he posted pictures of his substantial weapon collection and discussed supposed telepathic and extrasensory abilities. According to his posts, he believed he was on a special mission, receiving assignments from space. This seemed like delusions of a disturbed mind, and police suspected Sean indeed had serious mental disorders. He stubbornly refused to cooperate with the investigation, spoke nonsensically, and insisted on his innocence. However, when detectives checked the personal messages on his deceased brother's page, they found something intriguing. Back in 2006, when a $50,000 reward was offered for information on the double homicide case, Sean's former girlfriend had messaged Seamus, suggesting she could claim the reward by turning in her ex-boyfriend. They both knew everything but kept silent. Unfortunately, questioning either was no longer possible since the brother had been shot and the woman had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. An unexpected confession. Initially, Sean denied any involvement and refused to speak. But when shown the printouts of the messages between his former girlfriend and his brother, he surprisingly confessed and began to give a detailed account. His narrative not only surprised, but shocked law enforcement. Despite more than 13 years passing since the double homicide, Gowan remembered the details of that night vividly. That evening, he had left his house with a Marlin rifle, intending to hunt in a wooded area. He aimlessly wandered for a couple of hours before descending a trail to a wild beach, which he claimed was a spot to encounter boars. As he walked along the shore, he spotted 2 bright sleeping bags. Approaching closer, he discovered a young man and woman sound asleep inside. He stood watching them for several minutes, then suddenly heard voices in his head commanding him to end their lives. Sean claimed this was the mission from space. He could not ignore. He placed the barrel of his rifle almost against the young man's head and pulled the trigger. The sound woke the young woman, but before she could comprehend the situation, a second shot ended her life as well. He decided to collect the casings and carried them away in a beer can he had emptied while descending to the beach. Later, according to him, he tossed the can into some bushes in his father's backyard, where he went to give the rifle to his father, and asked him to hide it. His elderly father asked no questions and simply buried the weapon in the dirt floor of the cellar in his old barn. Remarkably, Sean's claims were verified. The rifle was found at the site of the now-collapsed barn, and the beer can with the casing still rested in the overgrown bushes in the backyard. The fact that the murderer's father had passed away in 2009 and his property had since fallen into disrepair and abandonment helped preserve these items. It turned out that the bottle found on the beach had no connection to the crime and was mistakenly considered as evidence. Forensic psychiatric evaluation. Sean Gowan blamed the voices in his head, which he claimed ordered him to commit acts of violence, and asserted that he was not aware of his actions. His defense attorneys also insisted that Sean was mentally ill and unfit to stand trial. It was up to qualified psychiatrists to determine the truth of these claims. The evaluation revealed that the accused did indeed suffer from a range of mental disorders, exacerbated by the effects of alcohol and prohibited substances. However, at the time of the crime, he acted deliberately, carefully planning each step. Sean was fully aware of how to proceed and how to cover his tracks to avoid police detection. This was precisely why he first ended the life of the young man, knowing that if anything went awry, the woman would not be able to resist. For the same reason, he took the casings with him and prudently gave the rifle to his father, asking him to hide it. According to the psychiatrists, although Gowlin had mental deviations, he was competent to stand trial and be held accountable for his actions. What was surprising in this complex case was that his parents, brother, and former girlfriend knew, or at least suspected, that he had committed the double homicide. Yet none of them had turned him over to the police. Trial and sentence. The trial of the accused took place in the spring of 2019, nearly 15 years after the brutal act against the couple. On June 17th of that year, Sean Gowlin was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 94 years for the end of his own brother's life in 2017. The convicted man is now serving his sentence in a special prison unit designated for particularly dangerous inmates with mental disorders. He continues to claim that he hears voices and behaves aggressively. Hence, he is kept under special surveillance to prevent him from harming himself or anyone else nearby. Lastly, it should be noted that the motive for the double homicide was never established. Sean simply saw the couple sleeping on the beach and decided to end their lives. Leonard Taylor was born in the United States in the mid-1960s. He was the son of Jesse, who also had another son identified as Perry Taylor. In the late 1980s, Leonard met a girl named Mia Perry, with whom he became romantically involved. Around this time, Leonard began to accumulate a criminal record. Initially, he was convicted on charges related to narcotics and concealed weapons in San Bernardino County and spent time behind bars, though the length of his sentence remains unclear. In September 1990, a 19-year-old man was fatally attacked following an argument in an apartment complex located in the same county. By then, Leonard, who had been released, was living in that area. Due to his criminal record, he became one of the primary suspects in the case, but managed to avoid any responsibility. As part of his scheme to evade justice, he used a false name, Michael Chambers. The following year, in 1991, Mia became pregnant. The news of his first child did not motivate Leonard to change his ways. During this time, he was arrested by the Drug Enforcement Administration and convicted for transporting and selling narcotics, leading to his incarceration in a federal prison. Since his daughter was born amid these circumstances, he was unable to be present with Mia during the birth. Facing reality, Mia named the baby on her own and prepared to raise her child independently. Soon after, what people thought became true. Leonard's connection seemed less likely with his newborn when, in 1992, he was found guilty of statutory rape and child abuse in San Diego County. While in prison, he disclosed to a local media outlet that he maintained connections with some scammers involved in irregularities related to corporate check frauds. Upon his release, Leonard embarked on a short-lived career in white-collar crime, which quickly returned him to jail, this time in the Missouri State Prison. The San Bernardino police arrested him again in 1999 for failing to register as a sex offender. Shortly after the beginning of the 2000s, Leonard was accused again, this time for intimate coercion against a minor. Aside from his illicit businesses, which required him to travel across the country, he maintained relationships and intimacy with multiple women simultaneously, earning him the nickname CAs, short for Casanova. Another standout trait of his criminal behavior was making and using fake IDs and different names, ending up with almost 20 of them at some unknown time. Married a woman living in California who also had an outstanding arrest warrant for a probation violation. It was during this time, under unspecified circumstances, that Leonard met Angela Rowe. Their first encounter took place in the city of Jennings in St. Louis County, Missouri. Angela was born around 1976. She had previously been in a romantic relationship with a man with whom she had other children, Alexis Conley, Acrea Conley, and Tyrese Conley. Despite being married and also being involved with another woman in Kentucky, Leonard began a relationship with Angela. After a rather brief period, he moved into her house located in the suburbs of St. Louis. Angela's home was well known among the neighbors for the constant joy radiated by her 3 young residents. From then on, Angela's house and her children also became the love nest for the new couple. By the end of 2004, Leonard and Angela had been living together for approximately a year, and according to her family and friends, their cohabitation was not without its challenges and difficulties. On Saturday, November 20th, 2004, a friend called Angela and asked to borrow $50. At that time of year, the traditional holiday season was approaching. Being a mother of 3 children, Christmas was particularly important. Therefore, Angela later took the time to decorate the house with her children, hanging large and striking candy canes at the entrance, and placing lights to add to the festivity. That weekend, the kids went to celebrate Thanksgiving early with Tyrone, their father, and his side of the family. Meanwhile, on Sunday, November 21st, Angela did not show up for her weekend shift as a housekeeper, but called to inform she would not be able to come. The following day, a friend called her, and they chatted as usual. The children returned to their mother's house and were seen by some neighbors in the following days. From that weekend in November 2004, several significant events occurred. Yet the how and when of the detailed events were something the authorities could never fully reconstruct. However, everything points to an argument between Leonard and Angela, during which she threatened him with a knife. He then overpowered her and shot her. In a turn of events, realizing that the kids had witnessed everything, Leonard took the lives of all 3 children. Afterwards, he turned off the heating and instead turned on the central air conditioning of the house. According to phone records, on November 23, 2004, at 11:24 p.m., Leonard called his brother Perry to ask for money. It is believed that during their conversation, he confessed to what had happened, adding that things had gotten out of control and that it wasn't what he wanted, but it happened. On the same day, Angela's friend called the house phone repeatedly without getting an answer. A few hours later, at 12:05 p.m. on Wednesday, November 24th, she tried again without success. Between that day and the next, Perry told his girlfriend about what Leonard had done. On Thursday, November 25th, while most American households were finalizing details to celebrate Thanksgiving, Perry went to his girlfriend's house. There, his brother contacted him again. After the conversation, Perry told the girl that Leonard was still in Angela's house, waiting for a letter from California. There were 3 more calls in the following hours, one of which was specifically made from the landline of Angela's house. It was during one of these conversations that Perry's girlfriend heard him ask Leonard how he was still there, specifically alluding to the presence of the bodies. What Leonard's response was remains unknown. Then a plane ticket from St. Louis to California was booked, with the transaction being made from a phone number with a California area code. Early in the morning of Friday, November 26th, Leonard went to his sister-in-law's house so she could take him to the airport. He had plane tickets from St. Louis to Ontario, California via Phoenix, Arizona. The ticket was in the name of Lewis Bradley, an alias that Leonard used and for which he had a Missouri ID that included his photo. He took the opportunity of being at his sister-in-law's house to leave a box that was to be delivered to his brother. Shortly after, according to some witnesses, he was seen disposing of a gun in a sewer near Perry's girlfriend's house, but the weapon was never recovered. On the way to the airport, Leonard told his sister-in-law that this would probably be the last time she would see him alive. Then, to elaborate on this strange notion, he added that some people were trying to kill him and that she should not pay attention to things she might hear about him. Cameras recorded Leonard that Friday morning passing through the security area at St. Louis International Airport. He was wearing dark pants, a pink shirt, and a cream-colored hat carrying 2 black bags. Shortly after, he headed to Gate 16 to catch the 810 Southwest Airlines flight to Ontario. Meanwhile, Angela's friend continued calling throughout those days until November 27th, never receiving a response. On the other side of the country between Saturday and Sunday, Leonard finally met up with his wife. During this time, Angela's absence was noted by her co-workers. But unlike previous occasions, there was no call from her to report anything. Leonard stayed in San Bernardino County for 4 days before driving across the country with a friend. He traveled through Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia, ending up in a house in Kentucky. For the week of November 29th, when classes resumed after the Thanksgiving holiday, the absence of Angela's kids at school did not go unnoticed. Then, with considerable concern over Angela's prolonged silence, her family asked the police to check on the woman and her 3 children. Thus, on December 3, 2004, police officers were sent to the small brick house in the suburbs of St. Louis. Once on site, the officers found several significant details, including that the front door was locked. Newspapers were piled up in the front yard and mail overflowed the mailbox. The team managed to enter through a bedroom window. The air conditioning was running at full power outside while the television was on. The next thing the agents had to face was far from an idyllic home scene. Wrapped in blankets, Angela was found lifeless, likely from gunshot wounds. Her 3 young children also appeared to have suffered fatal gunshot wounds, and their bodies were aligned on a bed in the early stages of decomposition. The coroner found out that the victims had passed away 2 or 3 days before their bodies got stiff. Meanwhile, during subsequent thorough investigations at the residence, investigators found 2 non-functional cell phones, and there was no evidence that Angela had any other cell phone in use besides her own. As often happens in such cases, Leonard was immediately considered the main suspect. This was initially due to his relationship with Angela, but it is fair to say that his extensive criminal history also raised suspicions. As the police tracked his whereabouts, Perry was interrogated about the accusations against his brother on December 8, 2004. During that interview, Perry told detectives that Leonard had called him and admitted to his actions. After an intense nationwide chase, police monitored a house in Madisonville, Kentucky, where Leonard was staying. On December 9th, Leonard tried to flee by hiding on the floor of a vehicle and was arrested on the spot, holding a knife in his hand and moving under the alias of Jason. Beyond that, he made no moves nor uttered any comments. The sunglasses Leonard wore at the time of his arrest, along with a few other belongings, were taken as evidence, although nothing seemed to suggest that these objects could provide any clues. Later, the police made some statements about the arrest. According to the detective in charge, Leonard's wife was not much help in the investigation. Authorities believed Leonard had turned to her for money to facilitate his escape. While the only suspect was finally in custody, the funeral services for Angela and her kids were held in Missouri. Standing beside his oldest daughter's coffin, Tyrone could not help but break down. Leonard maintained his innocence throughout, and indeed, his defense focused on the fact that he was in California when the bodies were discovered. His case was also based on the probable date of death stated by the coroner. However, the suspicions for the 4 deaths were only part of his legal troubles. Thus, while awaiting the resolution of the case in April 2005, Leonard began serving a 100-year sentence for an unrelated conviction. 5 months later, he filed a request for the state to notify him if there was any intention to use DNA evidence in the case involving Angela and her 3 children, and if so, what type it would be and whether physical evidence had been presented for analysis or examination. On May 25, 2006, Leonard filed a motion requesting the return of his personal belongings, including the sunglasses he wore when arrested. But in August 2006, the state took possession of the glasses and other evidence that were in police custody. And 3 months later, in November, all items were taken to the forensic lab for analysis. There, experts conducted a specialized test, which is used to determine the possible presence of blood. The procedure yielded a positive result for the presence of blood on the nose pad of the sunglasses. But there was a complication since the sample was very small. For this reason, a second confirmation test to detect the presence of DNA was not performed. Between the end of that year and the beginning of 2007, the stain was subjected to DNA testing. But due to its size, the professional in charge could not obtain a complete genetic profile. What was obtained from the partial genetic profile excluded Angela's children. However, the presence of her DNA could not be ruled out from the study. Specifically, the result had a probability of matching one in every 12,300 people belonging to the African American population. In May 2007, Leonard filed a motion to exclude the results of these tests as evidence in the trial. A hearing was held where the state explained that the reports were disclosed as soon as they were received and that contrary to what Leonard suggested, the evidence was not deliberately hidden. Ultimately, the trial court rejected his request. In January 2008, Leonard again insisted on the same point by filing a new motion to exclude any evidence related to the specialized test. Another hearing took place, and the court overruled Leonard's objection, thus admitting the validity of the results as evidence of the presumed presence of blood. During the trial that year, Leonard objected to the admission of this evidence, but again faced a setback when the trial court dismissed his objections. However, the forensic scientist who conducted the tests testified that the test is presumptive because it can also yield a positive reaction to substances like potatoes, rust, bleach, and nickel. He also emphasized that since there was no confirmatory examination, the substance on the glasses was only possibly blood. Leonard did not testify at his trial. However, the coroner did testify, and his testimony marked a significant turn in the case, as he stated that the deaths could have occurred 2 or 3 weeks before the officers visited the house. This detail firmly placed the incident before Leonard's departure to California. He also explained that he had not initially considered the detail that the air conditioning thermostat was set to the maximum cold setting. When the state called Perry as a witness, the case seemed to turn again, especially when asked about his statement during the police interrogation, where he said that Leonard had confessed to the acts. He said he did not remember anything that happened and went even further to claim that his statements to the police had been the result of coercion by the authorities. After hearing from the various witnesses, it was time for the closing arguments. The state, represented by the prosecution, emphasized that the blood sample found on the man's sunglasses was indeed Angela's. In this sense, it was recalled that scientific evidence does not need to be conclusive to be admissible. Indeed, while some states require it to be so, other states have held that presumptive blood tests are admissible as long as they are accurately described, achieving their purpose of being useful to the jury. After deliberating for 4.5 hours, the jury found Leonard Taylor guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of armed criminal action. But there is something particular about his sentencing. Although it has not been possible to determine when and how, it seems that during his time in prison, Leonard converted to Islam, even changing his name to Rahim. Thus, during the sentencing hearing, also known as the penalty phase, he prohibited his defense team from presenting witnesses. Instead, he stated he was Muslim and expressed to the judge that Allah, not the court, would determine his fate. The state presented evidence, including Leonard's previous convictions. Testimony was also offered from a victim who was forced by Leonard to have intimacy and 3 members of Angela's family. The jury found 5 aggravating factors for each victim, among them mental provocation, which made the acts considered outrageously vile, horrendous and inhumane, thereby exhibiting cruelty and disdain for the sanctity of all human life. Consequently, Leonard was sentenced to capital punishment. The execution by lethal injection was scheduled for February 7, 2023 at a Missouri prison. The case attracted the attention of several groups dedicated to defending Leonard's innocence and therefore demanding a review and commutation of the sentence. However, the man's claims of innocence were rejected time and again. In response to some of the appeals, the Missouri Attorney General's office stated that the case against him was solid. Perry, Leonard's brother, died in 2015. In January 2023, as the execution date loomed, Leonard's attorneys requested a hearing on their client's claim of innocence. They were supported by a provision in Missouri law which allows a prosecutor to file a motion for a hearing before a judge in case of new evidence of a wrongful conviction. Firstly, Leonard's defense team proposed a theory about an alternative perpetrator. After a drug deal went wrong, Leonard thought he would be targeted for murder, so he quickly left town. However, the traffickers showed up at Angela's house, and failing to find him or the illicit substances they believed were hidden there, they unleashed their fury on her and her 3 young children. Secondly, the defense team obtained statements from Leonard's daughter and from Mia, her mother. Both stated that he was in California at the end of November 2004, and according to the lawyers, he could not have been the perpetrator of the crimes. These documents were subsequently presented to the Conviction Review Unit within the prosecutor's office. The following month, just hours before the execution, St. Louis County prosecutor rejected the request for a hearing before a judge, stating that the facts did not support a credible case of innocence. Concurrently, the governor refused to grant a pardon, and the United States Supreme Court also declined to intervene. Finally, on Tuesday, February 7, 2023, in the evening, everything was arranged to carry out the procedure. In his final statement, Leonard said that Muslims do not die, but live eternally in the hearts of family and friends. Taylor kicked his feet as the 5 grams of pentobarbital were administered, then took 5 or 6 deep breaths before all movement stopped. Harold Sasko, better known as Hal, lived in Kansas City. He was born on September 11, 1961, in Dottsville, Florida, and was one of 12 children in the family. His siblings described Harold as a person who was ready to take responsibility in almost any situation. He often helped his brothers and sisters with household chores and was generally very organized. So it was not surprising that after graduating from college, Hal opened his own pizzeria. And just 2 years later, he expanded his business by starting a second restaurant. This led to his move to Lawrence in late 1990 with his then-wife Anna and their 3-year-old daughter Mendez. There, not far away in the city of Topeka, opened a third restaurant. Harold became dependent on his business, and his hard work and lifestyle focused solely on work did not suit his wife. After all, Hal was not only a business owner, but also a husband and father, so his wife and child deserved his attention. Eventually, this led to a serious rift between the couple, and when his wife could no longer endure the lonely life, they decided to divorce. Hal was considered a church parishioner, and he was proud of being not only a man of God, but also a respected member of the community. Those around him knew him as a kind, caring, and extremely organized manager. So it came as a real shock to the community when on January 17, 2014, their so-called good and caring manager suddenly disappeared. Chapter 2: Harold's disappearance. The day began like any other Friday. The weekend was just around the corner, and many people went to work to carry out their daily duties. Of course, this day was no exception for the pizzeria employees. The problem was that when they arrived at work, they found themselves in a quiet and empty restaurant. Usually, Hal was there to unlock the kitchen, but this time he was nowhere to be seen. Even stranger was the fact that it had been several days since anyone had heard from him. Concerned about his well-being, the employees called the police and demanded a welfare check at his home on West 26th Street. Later that day, a police officer was sent to his residence. When he knocked on the front door, he was met with silence. When he knocked on the front window of the house, he also received no response. The officer then looked inside to see if anyone was home, and it was at that moment that he saw the figure of a man lying face down on the floor. Calling for backup, law enforcement officials burst into the house. It was confirmed that the man on the floor was Hal, and moreover, he was lying in a pool of his own blood. It immediately became apparent that he was already geeg, and judging by the condition of his body, he had been dead for several days. Moreover, it was not an accident. His hands were tied behind his back with zip ties, which were used to keep him under control. Hal's legs were also tied, but the most horrifying detail was that his throat was cut so deeply that the moaning side was shattered. With such a serious and brutal wound, he had no chance of survival. The officers were faced with an extremely gruesome scene. To top it all off, the police found several empty bottles at the other end of the room, as well as a phone and laptop that did not belong to Hal. They also noticed the absence of Hal's car in the driveway. But the strangest piece of evidence left at the crime scene was the word freedom sloppily written on the wall in Hal's blood. Chapter 3: The Investigation. The sudden influx of officers in the area undoubtedly drew increased attention from curious neighbors. The police decided to use this to their advantage and began asking more questions. That's how they learned that Harold was not living alone. His neighbors claimed that he was living with a girl he called his stepdaughter. This information turned out to be very important for the officers. Now they knew that there was a person who not only knew Harold well and was in constant contact with him, but was also present at the crime scene. Eventually, it was established that the so-called stepdaughter was 18-year-old Sarah Gonzalez McLean, who had been living with him for the last 2 years of his life. However, a problem arose. Sarah was nowhere to be found. This, of course, greatly concerned the officers. Finding Sarah became a top priority for law enforcement, as they had no idea what exactly had happened to her. She could have been abducted, become a victim, a witness, a suspect, or perhaps none of the above. In any case, it was now absolutely necessary to find her. Family members and friends were informed about this horrific crime. And 3 weeks later, on February 8th, a funeral was planned in memory of the lost community member. The public was urged to contact Douglas County forensic investigators and provide any information about Sarah's whereabouts. A reward of $1,000 was announced for any useful information. Chapter 4: Sarah's background. Sarah Gonzalez McLean was born on July 9, 1994 in Topeka, Kansas. She grew up in a loving family of 5. She had a brother and a sister. Throughout her childhood, Sarah was known as a shy but kind child. Since she was homeschooled for many years, she had few friends outside her neighborhood. However, this does not mean that she had a bad upbringing. Her parents were wonderful people, and she was always close to her sister. Unfortunately, when Sarah was a teenager, her parents eventually decided to divorce, which significantly affected her at such a vulnerable age. After her parents' divorce, her childhood and adolescence unfortunately only worsened. Sarah was quite naive, having been sheltered from the outside world by her parents. And unfortunately, people who are ready to take advantage of such a situation are always around. After her parents' divorce, Sarah experienced inappropriate behavior from a neighbor, and unfortunately, he eventually abused her. This event greatly influenced Sarah's character and behavior. She began to act completely differently than before. Much to her mother's dismay, Sarah began sneaking out of the house at night and hanging out with the wrong crowd. Even worse, this led to her frequent use of illicit substances and alcohol to drown out her suffering. It seemed that after her parents' divorce, Sarah no longer wanted to stay in her family home. That's when the pizzeria hired her. At first, he seemed like an ordinary kind manager, but there were rumors among the staff that he was not quite what he appeared to be. For example, Hal told all the restaurant managers that they could only hire young, attractive women. Chapter 5. Sarah's work at the pizzeria. While working at the pizzeria, Sarah would wake up, go to work, spend time there, and eventually return home to her family. She often spent nights drinking before returning home. According to some reports, she was only sober at work, if you could call it that. Despite the fact that she often came in drunk and nearly got fired several times over those few months, she somehow managed to keep her job. That's because Hal seemed to feel sorry for her. He knew that she was vulnerable and needed extra support. She tragically experienced another traumatic event. One such evening, another man attacked her, and to top it all off, the scumbag even burned her with cigarettes. After that, Sarah's already fragile mental health completely crumbled. She stopped going to work, lost friends, and sank into a very dark state. And then, she attempted to take her own life. Fortunately, Sarah's family found her in time to call an ambulance. She fully recovered, but it was only after the girl spent 5 months in the hospital. The nicest thing was that after being discharged from the hospital, Sarah received support from loved ones and friends. But one of these messages of support stood out in particular. It was from her former boss, Hal. After her tragic ordeal, Hal offered to become her personal life coach or even a kind of guardian. He could pick her up, take her somewhere to eat, and even let her express everything that was on her mind. Since there was no one else to turn to, Sarah eventually enlisted his support. It was during one of these walks that she told him her entire story, including her tragic encounters with other men, drinking, and everything else. Now Hal knew that she wanted to leave her family home, and upon learning about the traumas she had experienced, he suggested that she live with him in his own house. It all seemed a bit dubious. The problem was that Sarah was vulnerable, lost, and hurt. Hal's offer gave her a way out of it all. Chapter 6. Sarah's life with Hal. After moving in with Hal, everything seemed to stabilize for a short time. She found a new job far away from the pizzeria, took great care of her. Her dog moved in with her, and she even considered college. But Sarah's mother was unhappy with the whole situation. She found Hal quite strange, and the whole story seemed very suspicious to her. Every time she tried to talk to Sarah about it, it always ended in a big fight, which, of course, further alienated her daughter. Michelle didn't believe that Hal's intentions were always as innocent as he made them out to be. Even worse, she believed that her daughter was most likely too naive and prone to illusions to realize it. After the divorce, Sarah's father broke off all contact, and now she was trying to fill the void that had formed. To make the situation even more eerie, eventually asked Sarah to call him Gad, and then he told all the neighbors that she was his stepdaughter. It's not surprising that Sarah's colleagues eventually fob out about all this and inquired about her relationship with Hal. Now, when asked about it, Sarah insisted that he was just her friend and nothing more. But from an outsider's perspective, it was strange that a 50-year-old man brought him attractive but troubled 18-year-old girl into his home, and perhaps her peers suspected something. As soon as Sarah settled into the house and began to feel more comfortable, Hal started setting his own boundaries and attitudes towards life, especially when she turned 18. This change was quite alarming. Hal began buying her illegal drugs and alcohol, joking about them dating, and even brought up the topic of a sexual relationship with Sarah. In addition to these changes, he openly kept track of everything he bought for her, including alcohol, illegal drugs, cosmetics, and rent. He wanted her to feel indebted to him, and he also told her that she would only be able to leave once she paid him back. In fact, she felt so trapped that after she turned 18, she gave in to his advances, and her relationship with the man she once called Dad now became sexual. This diabolical situation lasted for a whole 10 months, and according to Sarah, they had sex several times a week. The only way she could cope was to drink and use illegal substances until she no longer felt involved in the situation. This, of course, further increased her debt to the man who was now using her body. On top of everything, Hal berated Sarah just as often as he complimented her. For example, he criticized her nose and then offered to pay for plastic surgery, which she, unsure of herself, eventually agreed to. It was clear that Hal treated her as his personal property, rather than as another human being with feelings. He also paid for her gum implantation, and his next goal was to buy her breast implants. Both of these surgeries cost $16,000, which of course was added to the bill, and she had to pay him back when she could afford it. She found herself trapped with no way out. In addition to this, Hal also threatened Sarah, telling her that he had connections if she ever tried to escape. From that moment on, her mental health deteriorated even further. In response, she was given antidepressants to cope with the situation, for which she would eventually have to pay again. Chapter 7. Sarah kills how trapped by the mental trauma of abuse and depression, Sarah's mind became clouded. She repeatedly found herself on the brink, and now, after supposedly finding someone she could rely on, he too turned out to be an abuser. Sarah had absolutely had enough, and she began to act in a way that eventually turned the victim into a killer. After visiting a pet store, she bought a rabbit and signed a waiver before taking it home. That same evening, one of Hal's pizzeria managers was visiting the house for dinner and drinks. The manager was shocked when he opened the refrigerator and saw a rabbit carcass instead of beer. Sarah not only admitted that she was responsible for killing the pet rabbit, but also stated that it was not the first animal she had killed. Completely bewildered by the situation, the manager politely stayed for dinner, but then went home. This was a huge red flag, and an indication of what Sarah was potentially capable of. Unfortunately, this sign was ignored. The main question remained whether Sarah was truly capable of killing a person. Although Sarah was initially considered missing, it was soon established that she was actually the prime suspect. Unfortunately, the detectives were not mistaken in their assumptions. They suspected that she had packed all her belongings, taken the dog, stolen Harold's car, and fled to Texas. However, along the way, she changed her plans and headed to Florida. It was warmer there, and the idea of admiring the ocean view seemed pleasant. Given this newly received information, she was officially declared a wanted person. Sarah was not only wanted on suspicion of murdering Hal, but also as mentally unwell and possibly dangerous to others. Her name was on the lips of many officers across the country, and this continued for 11 days. On January 25, 2014, after being on the run for just over a week and a half, Sarah McLean was finally found and arrested in Everglades National Park. Not surprisingly, the police officer found her in Hal's stolen car, sleeping next to a loaded gun. They also found $2,400 in cash, 2 more guns, an axe, and a couple of knives, one of which was stained with Harold's blood. Chapter 8: Sarah's Trial. A few hours after her arrest, a 3-hour interrogation began, during which Sarah confessed to killing the man. According to her version of events, the story unfolded as follows. On January 14, 2014, Harold returned home after a long day at work. The sound system had recently broken down, and he decided to devote the evening to repairing it. He asked Sarah to bring him a beer, and then another and another. After a few hours, fatigue took its toll, and Hal suddenly passed out on the floor. He didn't even suspect that Sarah had actually put a large amount of sleeping pills in one of his last bottles. By that point, she had already decided Hal had to die. She tied him up with zip ties, took a hunting knife, and then a few minutes later slit his throat. Shortly after that, Harold died in his sleep. Sarah then took a shower, listening to her favorite music, and washed all the blood off herself. After that, she called work to say that she would be out for a few days because, unfortunately, a relative had passed away. She then packed her things, including a photo of her sister, took the dog, and disappeared into the night in Hal's stolen car. To avoid being found, she left her cell phone and laptop at home. During the interrogation, Sarah openly shared her motives. She was locked in the house and in debt to a man who clearly wanted to possess her. She became his target, was abused, and then turned into his property. Anger clouded her thirst for revenge, and regardless of the consequences, revenge was exactly what she wanted. Sarah also expressed a strong desire to resort to violence. She admitted to killing rabbits out of curiosity. She also claimed that for 2 years, she had thoughts of violence and noticed that they were progressing. Obviously, Sarah's confession put her in a very difficult position. She not only confessed to killing Hal, but also to enduring violence. Given these horrific facts, it became absolutely clear that she would face trial. However, it was also clear that Sarah was undoubtedly mentally unwell. So first and foremost, she would have to undergo a psychological examination. In addition to her recently developed penchant for violence, she also claimed to have memory lapses, and felt that she was an observer in her own mind. Not surprisingly, Sarah was eventually diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. In Sarah's mind, she was not just Sarah. She was also Vanessa, Alice, Neela, and the nameless one. Alice was the weepy and vulnerable side of Sarah, while Vanessa was the strong, militant fighter inside her. Neela was feminine, polite, and liked to please people. But of course, the saddest version of them was the nameless one, who took on all the consequences of the trauma and depression. Chapter 9. Sarah's sentence. When it came to Sarah's trial, her dissociative identity disorder was the main line of defense. She claimed that a girl named Alice wanted to take her own life, but the other personalities convinced her not to. After careful discussion among themselves, they decided that the only way out was to kill Hal. In a clearer and healthier world, Sarah's defense team argued that she was in a state of clinical dissociation when she committed her crime. The abuse Sarah endured living with Harold is alarming. However, it was ultimately deemed irrelevant as everything was consensual. From an investigative point of view, this was not compelling evidence. The defense itself also could not be persuasive, as the murder was clearly intentional. Unfortunately for Sarah, although her mental disorder was recognized as genuine, her defense failed to convince the judges, and she was ultimately found guilty of murdering Harold Sasko. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years. This greatly shocked both Sarah and her family. It became apparent that the abuse she had endured throughout her life and her mental state at the time of the murder were not taken into account when sentencing her, which means that her punishment was much harsher than she deserved. Sarah filed an appeal on the grounds that the abuse she suffered should have been considered during the trial. Unfortunately, by that time, more evidence of Harold's horrible behavior had been uncovered. After analyzing his computers, detectives found that they were literally riddled with illegal pornography. In addition, another woman, whose name remains unknown, claimed that Hal had hit on both of her daughters. Given all this new evidence, Sarah's appeal resulted in a 50% reduction in her sentence to 25 years. To this day, she still remains behind bars. And that's because although the judge concluded that Hal did indeed abuse his control over Sarah, it doesn't negate the fact that she still committed premeditated murder. Chapter 10. Conclusions. Sarah was initially a victim. Harold was a cruel manipulator of young women and did a very good job of deceiving many people in his community. However, some still remember him as an extremely generous person. Harold also had good sides. For example, he was known to have helped many employees get out of financial crisis, and whenever someone needed advice, he was always ready to help. Harold's family does not deny his shameful actions, but they testify to his positive character. He clearly needed help and did wrong, but he never deserved to die. Although Sarah's family agrees that she must be punished for her crimes, they also believe that the sentence was too harsh for someone trying to escape her abuser. Harold was undoubtedly a favorite of many people, but at the same time, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. This story is an example of how life circumstances, trauma, and a lack of proper support can lead to tragic consequences. Sarah became a victim of abuse by someone she trusted, and it caused irreparable damage to her mental health. However, this does not justify her actions, the deliberate murder of another human being. This story also demonstrates how important it is to be attentive to those around us and to be able to recognize warning signs. Perhaps if someone had intervened earlier, the tragedy could have been avoided. At the same time, this story raises questions about the fairness of the justice system. Was Sarah's punishment adequate, given all the circumstances? Was her mental state and the trauma she suffered sufficiently taken into account? These questions remain open for discussion. Ultimately, this story serves as a reminder that a completely different personality can be hiding behind a person's appearance. Harold, who many considered kind and generous, actually turned out to be a manipulator and a predator. This story prompts us to be careful in our judgments of others. Lucy Davies was born in 1971 in the county of Rhondda, England. She was the daughter of Roger and Andrea Davies, who were also the proud parents of another girl named Anna. The family was settled in a small community mainly formed by socially purposed housing. There, against the backdrop of beautiful mountain scenery, Lucy had a particularly happy childhood. Since she and her little sister had similar tastes, they were always very close. Her parents always highlighted Lucy's infectious joy as a standout quality. During her time in primary school, Lucy was known for her outgoing and likable temperament, which immediately endeared her to teachers and classmates alike. In addition to her charming personality, she was also recognized for her undeniable beauty, making her one of the most popular and admired girls at school. Regarding interests outside of academics, both she and Anna loved ponies. Knowing this, their father pleasantly surprised them by enrolling both in the local riding club. This sporting activity taught them discipline and also showcased their talent. Consequently, they earned the right to participate and represent the club in countless events and competitions. Thus, by the start of secondary school, Lucy shone as an exceptional rider. However, her energy and passion were not limited to the tracks, as the versatile young lady began to take flute and piano lessons, dedicating long hours to practice to master both instruments. Her efforts soon paid off, and by the following year, had a very comprehensive and detailed mastery of the wide field of classical music. Thanks to this, she was accepted into a youth orchestra and also joined her school's choir group. As often happens in this stage of adolescence, a healthy romantic interest appeared in her life, and Lucy became very close to Gareth Jenkins. However, she preferred to keep it a secret. In 1989, after finishing secondary school, Lucy was determined to pursue a career in the musical world. With that goal in mind, she enrolled to undertake a bachelor's degree at the University of Warwick. There, she began her new and promising life, always with the aspiration of becoming a teacher and dedicating herself to musical education. But things did not go as she had expected. While her passion remained, she did not enjoy the direction of the degree program. Consequently, she decided to switch her original plan and opted to study urban planning. It was around this time that she met Graham McAllister. They both discovered quite soon that their outlook on life was very similar. Aside from their love for art and shared interests, a crucial detail in their bond was the extravagant sense of humor that complemented each other. Their relationship flowed naturally, and as they made plans for the future, Lucy decided to introduce him to her parents. For Roger and Andrea, the meeting was wonderful, as they were certain that Graham was the right one for their daughter. So much so that they decided to buy Lucy a house in the city of Coventry, northwest of London. This gesture, in addition to ensuring her a life free from the upheavals of rent and moving, carried their wish for her to start a family. Shortly after moving in, invited her boyfriend to share the new home. As they continued with their studies in 1995, the young couple welcomed their first child, whom they named James. Lucy decided it was best to take a break from university to care for him. Meanwhile, Graham continued with his university commitments and to support the household expenses, got a job working the night shift at the city's postal sorting office. Over the months, this dynamic began to affect Lucy because alone at home, dedicated exclusively to the child, and with many hours away from her partner, a feeling of boredom took hold of her. Then she found no better solution than to explore internet chat rooms for distraction. In this universe, she sought to meet new people. One night, while Lucy was immersed in lively conversations in various chat rooms, she came into contact with Harold Landry. At 53 years old and of American origin, Harold came from a financially struggling family in Louisiana. However, he understood early on that being just one among a dozen siblings, he would have to achieve everything through his own effort and will. Thus, from a young age, he dedicated himself to hard work to escape poverty. His opportunity arrived when he realized that in the oil business, the key was not in owning a well, but in providing the essential infrastructure for the owners of such fields. Consequently, he founded his own company, focused exclusively on the design and manufacture of hydraulic equipment for major oil companies in the southern United States. As he had anticipated, the business allowed him to amass a great fortune, eventually reaching billionaire status. By that time, he divided his time between his eccentric hobbies and a property on the island of Cozumel in Mexico. On a personal level, he had been married and divorced twice. From these unions, he had children whose exact number and identities are not publicly known. What was known, however, was that Harold made sure they lacked nothing. A particularly relevant event occurred in 1992 when, being single again, he met a married woman 20 years his junior, however. Neither her family nor her husband were obstacles for Harold, who directed all his seductive strategy towards her and won her over. On February 6, 1994, Harold picked her up to take her for a ride in New Orleans. For this occasion, they hired a babysitter. After concluding the evening, Harold accompanied his lover back to her home and offered to take the babysitter back to hers. No one seemed concerned about the fact that the husband would find out about the betrayal and could act as a wounded man. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Outside the residence, the betrayed husband was monitoring every move of his wife. Once the third party said goodbye, he followed him in his car. A few minutes later, Harold finally noticed the vehicle tailing him. Then, almost as an instinctive gesture, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out the firearm he usually kept. When both stopped at a red light, things spiraled out of control, as the babysitter later narrated. Harold then brandished a revolver at the betrayed husband and fired. The bullet severed an artery in his neck and damaged a nerve leading to a vocal cord. The husband, called Chris Price, collapsed on the pavement with a wound on his neck. But fortunately, there was a hospital right in front of them, which allowed him to receive immediate aid, and the doctors were able to save his life. As for Harold, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The trial against him took place in 1997. In his opening statement, the defense attorney told the jury that Chris had only been the victim of a tragic and sordid affair. Regarding his client, he mentioned that he acted out of fear and in self-defense. The defense's clever strategy led the jury, consisting of 4 men and 8 women, to find Harold guilty of the lesser charge of aggravated assault. As a result, he was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. After appealing, Harold obtained probation. In exchange, he had to pay a fine of $500 and fulfill community service obligations. Although he sought to be completely exonerated, he thanked Pat for his hard work. Since then, they became great friends. Shortly after, Harold and Chris agreed on an undisclosed settlement amount. By the time Harold began talking with Lucy, he was residing in Covington and was still wealthy enough not to have to work. He was also honest about his occupations and everything related to his past life, including love affairs and legal details. But all these elements only served to increase Lucy's attraction to him. What followed was an engaging online romance, with Harold promising her a more than tempting lifestyle. His persistence and persuasive power bore fruit when Lucy finally asked Graham to end their relationship. Thus, he had the path clear without a rival that could cause him trouble, as had happened with Chris. With the wind in his favor in the early 2000s, Harold traveled to England to meet her, and she took the opportunity to introduce him to her parents as her boyfriend. Although Roger and Andrea were surprised by the significant age difference, they respected their daughter's decisions and did not object to the relationship. Feeling fulfilled and fortunate to share his life with her, Harold spared no effort to surprise her, whether with luxurious gifts or anything else Lucy desired. In fact, by then, he was so in love that he was already planning to propose marriage. However, he didn't want it to be just any proposal. He wished to do it in an ideal setting. To achieve this goal, he took her, along with her son James, and included Graham in the group on a trip. The chosen destination was Mexico, which for Harold was by then his favorite place in the world. Additionally, his longtime friend Pat, who had been his attorney in the past trial, also had an apartment close to his residence, which added to the feeling of comfort. Initially, Harold bought a diamond ring and shared the news with enthusiasm with Pat. Nonetheless, his friend harbored certain suspicions about his future fiancée. Moreover, over the days, Pat found it strange that Lucy had dedicated a good part of her time in the company of Graham. He seemed to be completely blind to it, and ultimately he proceeded with his plan to propose. Lucy happily accepted the proposal, and in mid-2003, the couple celebrated their union. Shortly afterward, Harold surprised her by acquiring a $1 million property in an exclusive neighborhood in Worcestershire. In this rural setting, the marriage had a prosperous and peaceful start, further favored by the presence of excellent neighbors like Rachel Clark and Stephen Kennedy, with whom Harold and Lucy formed a lovely friendship. Soon the newlyweds had their first daughter, whom they named Harriet. The event filled both Lucy and Harold with joy, and from then on he dedicated himself to the little girl with undiminished energy and commitment. Equally important and affectionate was the relationship he maintained with James, whom he treated as if he were his own son. But relentless time began to erode their initial bliss. Gradually, the demands made towards Lucy increased, and her moodiness became directly proportional to her husband's demands. As he saw it, his wife was to constantly adjust to his preferences and adopt a submissive role to his requests. She, on the other hand, had different expectations, so tensions quickly became apparent. As a conclusion, Lucy was direct and unafraid to express her thoughts. And in this dynamic, her husband was not willing to yield. With both having volatile personalities, their arguments often culminated in explosive breakups, followed by reconciliation once the storm had passed. Thus, moments that had once been pleasurable, like the children's vacations, became increasingly marred by fights. Meanwhile, James witnessed the disintegration of his mother and stepfather's relationship. To their neighbors' dismay, the disputes that stretched on for hours became a sort of regular soundtrack. By that time, Rachel and Stephen were aware that the couple had a tendency to abuse alcohol, knowing well that this was the fuel that ignited their shouting and complaints. When Lucy and Harold unleashed all their anger, leading to prolonged periods of not speaking to each other, their neighbors felt peace return. In mid-2009, thanks to social media, Lucy reconnected with Gareth. Having had no contact since their platonic love in secondary school, they caught up and chatted for hours, with necessary interruptions due to both of their commitments. After Harold went to sleep, his wife stayed in front of the screen. Soon, it became evident to him that, feeling unhappy, his wife had resorted to the same escape route through which she had found him, and he had no doubt she was looking for a replacement. However, far from confronting her, he considered giving her some space and traveled to Mexico, where he stayed for a while. Meanwhile, Lucy took the opportunity to invite Gareth to stay with her. In the autumn of 2009, her husband returned to England, thinking this time would resolve their marriage. But as soon as he stepped into the house, Lucy asked him for a divorce. Initially, he felt devastated. Then, after a few weeks, began a relationship. He met this new woman online. She lived in the vicinity and went by the name of Rachel. Parallel to each of their new romances, the divorce negotiations were underway. And as often happens, new conflicts emerged. Especially concerning the house, Lucy expected to keep it to ensure a roof over her children's heads. For Harold, on the other hand, this matter was non-negotiable. His solution was to offer her money to buy herself a more modest apartment on her own. At the same time, he completely excluded her from his will. Upon learning of the decisions of her still husband, Lucy flew into a rage. Her feelings of hatred towards him made her share everything about Harold's past with her son, James, not leaving anything out. Amidst the complicated process and considering the evident tension she was living in, Gareth invited her to spend a few days with him in Wales. Upon her return to familiar surroundings, Lucy no longer wished to disguise or hide her lengthy phone conversations with her new love. Meanwhile, both she and Harold were immersed in excessive alcohol consumption. The arguments escalated to unexpected heights, leaving the children at the mercy of a violent and unbearable atmosphere. On the afternoon of Monday, February 1st, 2010, Harold drank several glasses of wine. At one point, he received a package intended for Stephen. Around 9 o'clock at night, when Stephen returned from work, he found a postal notification indicating that his parcel had been delivered to his neighbor. The laundry's lights were on, so he went there. Harold invited him in and served him a glass of wine. After greeting Lucy and exchanging a few words, Stephen noticed how drunk his host was. He took his package, excused himself, and left. Subsequently, the couple engaged in a nonsensical argument, specifically over a furniture purchase she was planning for their move. James acted as the years of fights had taught him. This time, the disagreement escalated to a physical altercation. In the scuffle, Harold grabbed a kitchen utensil with which he struck Lucy on the cheek. Unable to continue avoiding the facts, James appeared at the scene of the dispute and found his mother injured. He immediately called the police and then focused on securing his younger sister's safety. Not long after, Lucy and her children left the house seeking help. The first place she thought to go was to Stephen's house. However, just as she headed in that direction, Harold caught up to her and, with a knife, caused her multiple injuries. Then he left her under a bush in the garden and walked away. Alerted by the screams, Stephen went outside. It only took him a few steps to discover his neighbor. Although he initially thought she was unconscious, he quickly understood the severity of the situation. At that moment, responding to the emergency call, the police arrived at the scene. They called the paramedics and searched the vicinity for the perpetrator. However, they only found the children, hidden and terrified in the backyard amidst the darkness. Once on site, the paramedics acted as quickly as possible, and Lucy was transported to the hospital. Very shortly after, her heart stopped. Meanwhile, Harold went to Rachel's house and confessed that something terrible had happened, but without giving further details. He then gave her 3 bank drafts totaling $40,000, a sum of cash, the keys to his car, and several signed blank checks. Then he set off back home. By that time, several police patrols were trying to locate him. Eventually, they found him walking along the road and proceeded to arrest him. Roger and Andrea were overwhelmed with despair upon hearing the tragic news. In a statement shared by the police, they asked for respect during their time of unimaginable sorrow from losing their daughter. For now, they had nothing more to say to the media. From then on, all their attention was focused on looking after their grandchildren. The forensic examination confirmed that Lucy had died as a result of multiple stab wounds to the chest. With this evidence and having James as a first-hand witness on February 5, 2010, Harold appeared before the court and was charged with murder. The trial took place in early February 2011. It was presided over by Judge David Foskin. On this occasion, Pat was not the defender of his friend. That task fell to attorney Andy Childs. Despite the evident difficulty of his task, the defense attorney argued that his client had been provoked by the fury of his wife, who left him no alternative but to act as he did. During his initial statements from the stand, Harold, amidst sobs, stated that he loved Lucy and regretted his actions. He then adhered to the strategy laid out by his lawyer, admitting to involuntary manslaughter because, in his words, Lucy had pushed him to the limit. To highlight the violence of the case, the prosecution presented a very detailed animation of the multiple injuries suffered by the victim. This presentation was shocking to those present in the courtroom. Finally, on February 24, 2011, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Harold Landry guilty of the murder of his wife, Lucy Landry, who was 38 years old at the time of her death, while Harold was 64. The following day was for the judge to impose the sentence. He had harsh words for Harold, whose attack he described as indescribable and unforgivable. He also dismissed Harold's claims of possible provocation by Lucy, considering them a vain attempt by the defendant to save himself. Consequently, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before being eligible for parole. By that time, however, he would be over 80 years old. Lucy's loved ones thanked not only for the resolution, but also for the judge's remarks, which they felt almost perfectly expressed what they themselves felt. They noted that the sentence somehow helped alleviate the pain of their loss, although they also admitted that no number of years in prison for Harold would bring back Lucy's life, so they would have to work on accepting this painful reality. For his part, Harold insisted on proclaiming his innocence as he was heard saying he hoped to be able to appeal the sentence in the future. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.